Today we're going to be looking at some localized climate threats in Minnesota. We're going to be learning about relative problems, climate-based threats in our own state and our cities. And next week we're going to be learning about the solutions to these and ways to educate ourselves further.
So looking more into climate change threats in Minnesota, we've got this graph here that talks about the main contributors. So to start out, divestments, we need to talk about why we need it and what is being invested currently in our state. Then water-based themes is a big one, considering we are in a state of 10,000 lakes. So we can talk about agricultural pollution, runoff, erosion, sedimentation, and then things like overfishing and invasive species. Then for more local or city-based themes, in the past, we've talked about HERC and Line 3, and we have talked briefly about redlining in communities in the Twin Cities. We're going to talk more about that today. Then specifics on mining and oil-based pollution, specifically in the boundary waters and specific water sources throughout the state. Air pollution is a big one considering the incinerators, especially in Minneapolis and the Twin Cities in general. And then lastly, habitat and wildlife destruction is kind of self-explanatory. That's just land use changes and the extinction that comes from that.
So the State Board of Investors, which is Governor Tim Walz, State Auditor Julie Blaha, Secretary of State Steve Synan, and Attorney General Keith Ellison, are investing $5 billion of pension funds, which are kind of Minnesota's retirement funds, into the fossil fuel industry. And this is a little problematic because obviously, as we know, fossil fuels aren't sustainable. So what happens when they run out and all of our money is tied to that? And so divestment itself isn't really a problem, but it's more of a solution of where can we take that money and how can we reinvest it in kind of more renewable energy or a better solution.
So then to talk about the water-based threats specific to Minnesota, agricultural pollution is a big one. And we talked about that more in depth last week with our speaker, Ashley. And the big thing that Ashley brought up was that the amount of chemicals and pesticides used in farming and agriculture, those can really easily end up in the river. And that kind of connects to runoff and erosion and sedimentation, which is the idea that a lot of things from the land can end up in our many water sources. And specific to Minnesota, we put so much salt on the roads from winter, and it's really easy for that to end up in our water sources, along with those pesticides and chemicals from farming and agriculture. And so the more kind of chemicals and pesticides we put out, the more it's going to end up in our water, which harms species and the ability to get clean water in our state. Then mining pollution, we're going to talk more about the boundary waters. We also know that, mining can be really dangerous and negative to the environment around it if it's handled improperly. Excessive boating, overfishing, and invasive species makes it so the species in water sources have a hard time surviving and functioning the way they need to. So there is kind of a lot of water-based threats in Minnesota.
So next we're going to talk a little bit about environmental racism. And of course, in our current curriculum, we have gone over stuff like HERC and Line 3 because it is a very prevalent issue and it continues to be. But I really quickly want to talk about stuff like food deserts and air pollution. And so in this map over here, you can see, this is a map of St. Paul and Minneapolis. You can see all of these kind of yellow dots with the green areas around them. So those yellow dots are grocery stores. The green areas around them are areas that people can walk to them. But if you're seeing all of these little red dots in between, those are food deserts. And so those are locations where people live where they can't have access to clean eating or groceries or fresh produce at all. And so this is a really, really big issue because it contributes to a myriad of problems across things like health, the environment, a lot of stuff. And so you can see that these are concentrated around areas, low income areas, and then also communities of color, which is a big issue.
Talk more about mining and its negative implications on the boundary waters. So up north, the boundary waters has a lot of minerals, which makes it so mining companies like the Twin Metals Mining want to go there to get metals for smartphones, wind turbines, and other technologies they can use those resources for. And the thing is with mining is it can be really problematic and negative to the area and wildlife surrounding it because it can really get into the water, it can harm the species. And so basically the more mining there is, the more chances there are that there's going to be severe negative implications to the environment. And so we're specifically seeing that in the boundary waters.
And so, like we talked about in that slide about environmental racism, we've got air pollution. Air pollution is a really big problem in Minnesota. It contributes to as many as 10% of all the deaths in Minnesota, and that's data from 2019. And it especially harms people like the elderly, the poor, children with asthma. The Minnesota Pollution Control Agency says that 91% of Minnesota's communities of color and indigenous communities and 46% of low-income communities are above the air pollution-related risk guidelines. And I think that's compared to 36% of like the state. So way, way, way higher.
All right, so that's the end of this week's curriculum. And as you mentioned earlier, next week's going to be about more solutions and action-based steps for this.